What's up everybody, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and today we're going to talk about a new product from Schiit called the Gunnar. Now this sells for $230 US, and the prices will vary depending on where else in the world you live in if you're trying to acquire one. So if I talk about value propositions or compare it to other products that are in a similar price range, just assume I'm referring to US pricing, and then you can of course determine if it's the right value for you or not. Now you can save $15 if you have other Schiit products because you can buy it without a power supply. It does work without a power supply with less power, and we'll talk about that after, but it uses the standard 16-volt power supply that powers other devices like the Preamp or the Schiit Sin, which I'll be talking about later. Now at the time of this review, what was included in the box, at least for my unit, was the USB A to C cable, which mine's a little bit longer. This is 7 feet long, more than long enough, and it's rather thick as well. You also get a couple stickers in the box if you want to decorate your gear. And then of course you get a couple important adapters because the Gunnar, I'll probably do that more than once, is a unique product because it has a mic input as well. Now you get a breakout cable. This is a TRRS to dual 3.5, one for the microphone, which you can see clearly labeled, and then the other one for the headphone out. You also get a 1/4-inch adapter or a 6.3mm adapter. There haven't always been the highest quality adapters included in products like this. Mine in particular worked fine. I tested it against others, and I even did some measurements to make sure everything was working well, and the adapter works fine, so no issues there. Now the Gunnar was sent to me for review by Schiit Audio. Won't affect what I say about it. I have generic purchase links in the description below. They don't have kickbacks. If it's ever on Amazon US, I'll have that link, and that does do a small kickback, but you always want to purchase it through an authorized seller that you trust because this has a 3-year warranty, and I'd hate for you to lose that. So let's talk about the layout. You have a 6.3 or 1/4-inch output for your headphone, 3.5mm for the microphone, and they are right next to each other. How sweet is that? Because on the older Hell 2, if you have one of these, they were on the opposite sides of the chassis. And for the OCD folks out there, I actually like that they're next to each other. Now the next two switches are to adjust a couple things. One is the gain setting. You have a negative, 0, and high gain, and then you have a tone defeat button for these two knobs. So there's all these talks about crossfeed and how this helps kind of break down that wall and make things sound more open. The width knob, if you turn it up, what happens is a lot of the common notes, so you know, if there's something dead center that's heavy in bass or like a rumble, and you fade this to the right, it reduces or attenuates those frequencies a little bit to basically focus on the frequencies that are unique to the left and right channel, and that's how it's affecting width in this case. So conversely, if you go negative, then the unique audio properties of the left and right channel that are separate from each other, they start to pull in a little bit, and then the centered audio, such as an engine noise or like road noise if you're playing a racing game, for example, that will be brought more to the forefront. So this really does play around quite significantly with imaging, and I will talk about how this affects gaming performance later. I just want to explain the knobs from a function standpoint first. Then you have the presence knob. Now the presence knob is basically a boost to higher frequencies, but not all upper frequencies, and I will talk about that with showing some measurements. Negative is obviously negative presence, and then if you increase it, that's designed to help kind of basically bring vocals or certain instruments more to the forefront. Depending on which headphone or product you're using, if it's recessed, particularly in like the 1 to 2K region, for example, and you want to bring that up a little bit, well, just turn this knob up. And if it comes across as too shouty or too forward in the vocal range, then maybe dial it back a little bit. This is a really fun trick because this applies to anything you're connected to. Regardless of what you're playing or listening to, these knobs work, and you don't have to deal with software for that. So it's not just for gaming, but it can add some cool effects and also give you an extra layer of tuning for things like the 800S or the LCD GX, for example. You have your input switch on the right, which is going to toggle between your USB DAC, which is up, and then down, which is optical. So let's flip over to the back. There's the USB DAC, and there is your optical, so those are your inputs. You have a slider switch because there's a new layout inside. They went with a different topology. And then you have a line out. This is the 3.5mm pre-out. So what happens as far as the pre-out behavior goes, if there's a headphone plugged in, the pre-out will be deactivated. I should point to where it actually is. If you unplug the headphone, the pre-out is live again. So there's no switch to enable both at the same time. It's just a behavior that happens with the status of your headphone connection, so keep that in mind. Now, just to answer this, I know people are going to be curious. The pre-out does include the width and the presence knobs function. So if you are messing with all of these settings, but you want to play with that for speakers or an external headphone amplifier that has different characteristics, maybe more power or balanced output for whatever reason you're chasing for different gear, you can leverage this as a DAC only and use a 3.5 to dual RCA, for example, and then use this as your variable pre-out for your amplifier or speakers, monitors, whatever it may be. Then on the top of the chassis, you have a giant volume wheel, which is so easy to use. I can operate this with one finger, and because this has a little bit of weight with the 4 feet, it's extremely stable and easy to interact with. The only real criticism I have is the knob has a little bit of wiggle to it if you are really trying to find any kind of a fault. These are much more stable and they have decent resistance to them. Now the potentiometer has no channel imbalance issues, even on high gain. It was basically non-existent, and there's also no static noise when you're adjusting the potentiometer. One of the reasons why some people like amp DACs like the FIO K11 is because everything is digital, and that usually is more beneficial for very sensitive IEMs that you're listening to at a lower volume, because the steps are pretty much always linear. Well, thanks to negative gain and a very quiet noise floor, along with this high quality potentiometer, this is purely analog form for adjusting it, but it works extremely well. It's dead quiet, and I never had any scratchiness issues, at least on my unit.
All right, so I wanted to use some measurements to kind of explain how these knobs affect your sound quality beyond the whole perception of audio and how it kind of messes with the imaging and game experience and music experience. So I did purchase much more expensive measurement equipment to better measure amps and DACs. So that's coming. This is kind of my first attempt at it. So don't expect this to be exactly on the money as far as precision goes. I can't show things like Synad or crosstalk, for example. I wouldn't trust it because my DAC that I use, or my interface that I use, likely has worse performance than this DAC's output, so the tests wouldn't be accurate. However, I can show frequency response rather accurately. To just put it in perspective, this thing measures perfectly flat. That's to be expected. This slight roll-off that you get just below 20,000 hertz is just because the interface that I used has a little bit of a roll-off with that filter. It was the best performing interface I could use at the time, because the other ones tend to have more of a bass roll-off, and that is an even more inaccurate representation of how this performs. So if I turn the switch on to basically enable the width and presence controls, if the knobs are in the 0 position, which they do have a little bit of a notch, you get the exact same frequency response. So this just kind of validates what they were saying, as turning it on or off won't affect frequency response. I can't accurately measure Synad or crosstalk or distortion levels with it on or off, at least yet. But at least from what I can perceivably hear, there's no differences there. Now it gets really crazy when you turn on the presence feature and max out the presence knob. Look what it does to your frequency response. You have a huge lift. Primarily, I talked about this earlier in the 1 to 2K area, but it does lift all upper frequencies, and it starts as low as 100 hertz, provided that you, again, max it out. Now, if you don't max it out, you're going to have less of a lift, of course. This is at the halfway point, at least as close as I can get visually. You can go negative, of course, and if you do minimum presence, it's a very steep drop, and the peak of it is 1,200 hertz. And then if I go to the halfway point, let's try that. It is a little bit closer to neutral. So I actually kind of cheated this a little bit. It really aggressively creates a dip as you get to like that 90% threshold for reducing your presence knob. It's not fully linear in the negative position, but it seemed very linear in the positive position. Either way, you're going to mess with it to your own likings. You're not using it for measurements. It's, for actually gaming and listening to music on. I just wanted to show you how it impacted your frequency response, because if you are playing with this knob and you do your full EQ or your own EQ, I hope this helps you kind of better tune your EQ with the presence knob, if you ever were to do that for any reason. At least it kind of paints a picture. Now, if you play with the width knob, the width has kind of the opposite effect. If you max it out, you can see that the lower frequencies are basically sucked out, and then there's a little bit of a lift up top. If you go to minimum width, it kind of creates the opposite effect. Things sound a little bit heavier and more bassy, and there's a slight roll off on here. So again, you can play with this a lot and fine tune it. You of course can use both at the same time. So when you start adding all of these scenarios of different outputs as far as like tuning goes, you can get wildly different results because of what you're playing, what you're listening to, what your personal preferences are, your IEMs, your headphones, sound signature. There are so many variables that I can't say this is the ideal setting to use. It greatly depends on what you're playing and what you're listening to it on. But at least, again, this kind of paints a picture of how those knobs work. Now, I also wanted to show you the linearity of the microphone preamps, because pretty much all microphone preamps have some kind of bass roll-off, at least on the gaming DAC side that I've ever tested, and some of them even have upper frequency roll-offs as well, and this can affect the overall sound quality. Now, the human voice doesn't go super deep. We're not approaching 20 hertz or sub-bass levels of depth, regardless of how deep you think your voice may be. So sometimes you won't even hear a difference, and if there is a roll-off, it's usually minor enough where it's not really perceivable, unless it's pretty bad. So when we look in the Gunnar's mic performance, there is a little bit of a roll-off, and these artifacts, like these little spikes right here, by the way, in the frequency response, that's just the interface that I use to do this test. Again, this will get better as I upgrade my equipment. So just ignore the little spikes and look at the general curve of it. You can see that the roll-off kind of starts happening closer to 300 hertz, but it's really when you start getting below 100 hertz that it dips down. Now, this scaling doesn't look great, but it's only 7 decibel swing in the sub-bass region. It's not massive. However, it is more of a roll-off than the older Hell 2 mic linearity, which you can see does have more of a sub-bass presence. Again, your voice doesn't usually get this deep. I found that it did sound slightly warmer on the Hell 2 regardless. However, the noise floor was higher on the Hell 2. So we're going to get into noise in a minute, because that's much harder to fix in post-production if you are ever using this for like a podcast or live stream. I'd rather deal with EQ than trying to remove hiss. Now, I wanted to show you something. This is the Creative G6. It's a wonderful amp DAC. I've talked about it a lot because it has a microphone input as well. It has onboard 10-band EQ, very low output impedance, and frankly, it's just great for things like PlayStation. The one downside of the Creative G6 is the microphone preamp is pretty garbage. So I wanted to show you the linearity or lack thereof on the G6, and this is pretty bad, but this is where a lot of like inexpensive game DACs give you as far as microphone performance goes. You can see that basically below 200 hertz, my unit measured just kind of falling off a cliff. I also get almost no upper frequencies out of the microphone, so it's very compressed, it's very narrow. Most of your voice is in this range, but it's definitely not going to sound as good or as clear as both of the Schiit products that have much better microphone preamps. And using the same microphone in the same position, this is what my voice sounds like on the Schiit Hell 2, just so you can kind of hear a direct comparison. And lastly, this is the Creative G6 amp DAC that I just showed you in the measurements, so you can hear what my voice sounds like on this compared to the prior ones.
Now, in addition to the frequency response of the mic and how your voice sounds, again, the most important thing to consider is microphone preamp noise, which is, again, very hard to fix in post-production. You're always going to have a hiss sound, and the stuff you usually do to fix that makes things sound weird or worse in some cases. So I was nervous that because this didn't have an analog potentiometer, and with the new design and all these other features for basically 30 bucks more, that we might be stepping back on the microphone preamp side. And yeah, it rolls off just slightly more, but that's not really perceivable in real life. What you will hear, though, is a microphone preamp difference. So I want to preface this. There's 2 ways to test the Schiit Hell 2. Now, the Hell 2 has its own microphone preamp knob to make it stronger or weaker, but Windows has its own independent gain control. So there's 2 different levels of white noise to consider. The Hell 2 shines with Windows set more to 50 to 60% gain. Then you use the Hell 2 knob to turn it up. So I'm going to have a couple tests with maximum gain, and then I'm going to adjust these to where it's properly gained for the voice that I'm using, or like my mic and voice setup. So I'm going to have the microphone muted. We'll do an A/B test on both, and then you can hear the difference. So as you can tell, the Hell 2 is definitely much louder at max gain as far as a background hiss and noise goes, and this was all using the same cable on the same USB port on my machine. It was a little bit noisy, and that's not an ideal setup. So when you adjust the gains to better match your voice, the Hell 2 still falls behind the Gunnar, but it's not as bad. And depending on the nature of what you're doing, if it's a live stream and there's games happening in the background, it becomes even more difficult to hear. But it is nice to see and hear that the Gunnar is a better performer on the mic preamp side. Now, as far as power output goes, the Gunnar is an upgrade to the Hell 2 as well, and it's only bested by the Magni in this price range in terms of raw output. The Magni with the Unison DAC, if you just need a headphone out, is the better product. Again, if you don't care about the presence and width knobs. If you just want a loud and powerful amp that is clean and sounds great, that's where this one shines, and the power output is noticeable with harder to drive headphones. It's actually pretty remarkable that such a small unit has such a high output power. But it is loud and is clean. Now, I mentioned the whole power output change. If you're not using the included power supply, you're basically getting 10 decibels shaved off the top as far as peak output. However, even through the USB rail only, if I was plugged into my PlayStation 5, I could still power the Sennheiser HD800S, which is a 300 ohm headphone. It's still relatively easy to drive, but this worked on that. It worked on my HD6XX from Sennheiser, for example. And most, if not all, gaming products, including the LCD-GX, including something like the VZR Model 1, all of these do not need a lot of power. And this is really important because if you're ever getting an amp like this, but you want to travel and bring this with you, you don't have to bring the larger power cord. On the gaming side, it's got tons of overhead, and plugging it in, it does become quite apparent that there's a lot more power to be had. So it's not necessary, but I feel like if you're paying only $15 more to get the power supply, definitely do it because it is nice to have that overhead, especially if you're ever adding EQ or playing around with the knobs. Now, on the DAC side of things, it uses an ESS DAC. I don't want to focus too much on these specs because Schiit Audio posts a lot of this on their website, which is great, but at the end of the day, the specs alone don't really tell the whole story. The implementation, how the unit performs, is more important typically. But it does use ESS. It does go up to 32-bit 384 kilohertz, which is just absurd. You don't need that. Most people can't hear the difference after 16-bit 44 kilohertz, but again, it depends on what you're doing and what kind of overhead you're looking for. I usually run 24-bit 44 or 24-bit 48 kilohertz, depending on my whole device setup. Now, it does have an auto UAC 1 switch, and if you don't know what that means the same USB-C port and the same cable, when connected to PlayStation, this will automatically detect that, switch to UAC 1 mode, and allow you to use this on your game console. The microphone gain is excellent on this on PlayStation. I only had to go to about 35% for the PlayStation audio mic gain settings to use my drop PC38X. It was more than loud enough, and it sounded fantastic. Now, people might have this issue, and if you ever do, I just want to explain what this is and how it works. There's something called crosstalk, which is basically when the microphone signal is picking up some of your game audio or your content audio. Now, that means the chat and your viewers, if it's on a live stream, can sometimes hear the game of what you're hearing picked up through the mic. That's not because the microphone is picking up the sound from the speaker, although at high volumes that's certainly possible. But with a traditional gaming headset that uses something called a TRRS cable, the ground is shared with both the left and right driver. And when this happens, you do get a pickup of that same signal being electronically transmitted back into the microphone preamp, which again is why people hear it on the other side. It's not going to happen pretty much at all at lower volumes, but at much higher volumes, it's likely going to happen. It depends on your setup, but I just want to explain why that is. Now, if you get something like a drop PC38X or an EPOS H6 Pro, for example, there's a lot of gaming products out there that have a dedicated microphone signal. There's a second wire in the box in this case that breaks up that ground entirely, eliminating crosstalk, and it sounds significantly better. There are products like the Antlion Mod Mic, which if you buy the Uni system, which uses again a 3.5, now you're having something like a Sennheiser 800S with a Mod Mic attached to it, and that's its own completely dedicated microphone cable, which will plug into here, and then you don't have to worry about crosstalk either. So a lot of it is your setup or specific to your setup. Now, in the real world, do I always use width and presence to mess with my gaming? No. It really depends again on what you're playing and what you're listening to. What's kind of cool is even on something like a racing game, the width knob actually controlled how much road noise I heard. So if you're doing like a marathon run or an endurance race that's 20 plus laps on something, let's say you're playing Gran Turismo on PlayStation, if you turn the width knob up a little bit, it reduces the constant road noise that you hear, and it lets you kind of focus more on the side effects of the car. The transmission whine and all the gear shifts and the road noise and other cars around you are still very audible. But I found that I only had to increase it by about 20% to significantly reduce road noise. And if I pulled it back, road noise got louder. And I got a little bit more warmth and bass. competitive play, this is where a lot of people are going to have some questions on this, and it is super specific to the game and your headset, because if your headset is extremely bright or treble forward and you want to leverage this width knob to increase the staging effect or width of the sound that you're hearing, there is a chance the treble will be too strong. And if that's the case, you turn the volume down, and with lower decibels, it makes it harder to pick up some footsteps. So your mileage may vary. What I found that I liked and what was cool to me is, again, I did a subtle presence or width lift, and then I did some EQ after the fact based off what I heard. If you're constantly changing gear out, maybe this isn't an ideal situation, but the HD 800S is already super wide and it's a little bit treble forward, especially at 6,000 Hertz. So boosting this didn't really do it any favors. I didn't feel like I needed to. However, it definitely sounded wider and it sounds brighter. So again, temper your expectations as far as like, is this a cheat code for FPS? Because it's not. It comes down to all these other things involved with it. And the same thing happens with presence. I love the presence knob because when you have something like the VZR Model 1, it's very bass heavy, and the presence area, the 1 to 2K area, isn't super strong. So I still feel like that headset will always need a little bit EQ to fully shine, but I can get the width turned up a little bit and the presence turned up a little bit, and then it becomes even more laser focused for games like Call of Duty or Apex. Again, if the treble's too bright, you still have to add some EQ, but it can very much be a cheat code for a lot of things as far as like very quick adjustment depending on what gear you're switching to. I also like the presence knob for some stuff that comes across as shouty. So if you have a headphone or headset that's a little bit too forward in the 1 to 3K area, or you're listening to a track like Depeche Mode, which can be a little bit harder in that region, simply turning the presence knob down immediately relaxes that a little bit and makes it even easier to listen to. So yes, there are tangible benefits for FPS. There are tangible benefits for single story games if you want the games to sound wider or more impactful and bassy. But it's not always going to be this is a better approach. It's just nice that you have a very quick way to turn it on and off. And the last thing I want to say on the audio performance is if you assume all of that is off and you just want to use this as a headphone amp DAC, it's great at that too. The power output's insane. It sounds very clear. I don't find this amp too sharp. I also don't find it to sound lifeless or dull. It sounds fantastic, and the Magna Unity is one of my favorite amp DACs under 200 from raw performance. This is like, it's almost impossible to discern the difference aside from power output. So the fact that you get all these extra features like a good microphone preamp, the width and presence controls, all built in, it's a wonderful, just straight up headphone amp as well. So don't feel like just because it has a mic that you're just getting a gaming DAC. It works great for everything else. So that about wraps up this super long review. I really wanted to explain it from a technical side as well, because it's one thing to say what the knobs do, but visually representing that I think is helpful for understanding how it affects the sound quality and what you're hearing. Schiit makes some amazing products. Some products I haven't been as much of a fan of, but I really like the direction they're going lately. The Magna Unity is just for under 200 bucks if you just want a headphone amp with a lot of power. It's a wonderful system, but this is just so good for a little bit more, and you get all these extra features that unless you're chasing that raw power, I think the Gunnar is a better value. Now, something like the Schiit Sin is super unique. It has a remote with a motorized volume wheel. It has a lot of the same stuff, almost the same stuff as what the Gunnar does, but it also has surround sound processing built in, or at least it takes your stereo feed and gives you additional controls for your center and your surround speakers. It's a really cool product. I'll probably do a dedicated video on it soon. But purely from a gaming side, there's no other advantage or disadvantage to it. It's basically the same as a Gunnar with a lot of other features. So with that being said, I really hope you found this video helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're new to the channel, because I'd love to see it some future content. I have a lot of exciting stuff I have coming. So thank you all so much for the support, and I will see you soon. Bye.